Thank you, Sean, for sending me the link. That's fantastic.
Welcome. Just yeah, make your life easier.
Yes, just as long as you send them from the Calgary Chess School, that'll be great.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do it later in the future.
Yep.
Okay.
Tournament's all set up, and you can put the tournament link in the chat.
Okay. Well. Yeah, I'll do that. Let me see.
Well, they won't see it until the classes started. Some will. Some are already here.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will do that once. Once people. Yeah, once at 5 o'clock. I'll do that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. I think probably you can use your camera because I'm recording. So probably if you are showing your face is better. I don't know. That's just a suggestion. What do you think?
No, it's okay.
It's up to you. I mean, just suggesting.
Yeah. When I start streaming, then maybe I'll do that.
Okay.
Right now, I don't have the software and stuff like that, so.
Okay.
I don't. You can edit the recording after, yeah?
I can. It's just to take more time because yeah, I can edit and add more like games there, but I will see.
Okay. I want to. Okay. I want to share my screen. Okay, I've enabled screen sharing. So what you should see is my screen here. Just respond verbally if you say something verbally if you don't see it. There could be a little bit of noise in the background. My buddy's going to be eating, but don't worry about that. Okay, the opening that we're going to talk about today is an opening that you either love or hate. And that opening is starting with e4. And after e6, we have what is called the French defense. Now, this opening has been around a long time, and it was created mainly to solve the problem that occurs with double king pawns, which is with e4, e5. I'll just go back here. e4, e5. This is the most popular opening system or opening move for white and black. It allows both sides to establish a foothold in the center. However, since the e-pawn is unguarded by both sides, it presents a target for both sides' pieces. And so while it establishes some control over the central light and dark squares, it presents a problem for the f7 square for black. And this is a big problem, or was a big problem until ways to defend were found later on in the 18 and later 1900s. The big problem is the diagonal, or the Italian diagonal, from A2 to G8. And what white does is he starts some quick attacks involving the bishop's opening, which is this, and or the king's knight attack, which is this. And both of them seize the initiative for white and cause black to have to listen to what white is saying, as opposed to pursue his own agenda. Also, since the e-pawn is vulnerable to both knight f3, it is also vulnerable to f4, which is very romantic and very sharp, and is the king's gambit. So, how to solve the problem for black of establishing a central foothold and maintaining that central foothold? So this was addressed by, in a match, this defense had its successful debut in the London and Paris correspondence team match. So it had its debut in 1834, and it became, over the following years, it became the second most popular defense after e5. Now, since it's happening in 1834, the development of this opening system, there's not a lot of vigorous correspondence. So the ideas surrounding the defense and various improvements took a long time to get around. Mail was delivered, correspondence was delivered by a ship, and once it got on land, it was then delivered by horseback. And so new ideas didn't make their way into the popular mindset until, after several weeks, months, maybe in some cases years, type of thing. So the French defense itself features e6 as its response to white playing e4. First of all, the good things about the opening is, of course, the bishop still comes to c5 if it's able to do so. White's going to prevent that, of course. And the queen is able to possibly come out, you know, that would be against the fundamentals. But in the 1800s, chess ideas are still in their infancy. And so I suppose the queen could be brought out by individuals who didn't really know what they're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do in the opening is develop your pieces effectively and in such a way that your opponent doesn't get any tempo against them. So e4, e6, and what White wants to do is establish a pawn phalanx, like Morphy was wont to do. And so d4 came along. So the French is the second most popular opening after e4, e5, and it's only supplanted by the Sicilian defense later on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, I believe. So best play here is to play d4, and this is the classical way of playing. Both bishops can come out, both knights can come out, and White will have a little bit more space, and so aim to control the center more easily than Black. So Black challenges with d5 and gets a perfectly playable game if White plays what is called the exchange variation. This is played at your level, actually, quite often, and it aims at quick development. And the characteristic features of the exchange variation is one open file, which should lead to the exchange of at least one pair of rooks. A ram pawn, two ram pawns placed in the center on d4 and d5. And Black is going to be able to successfully find a spot for his bishop. White is going to play to prevent the placement of the Black bishop on f5. And so after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, sound play would be seen by bishop d3. So the queen dominates the g4 square, the bishop dominates the f5 square, so the only effective active place for this bishop, should it want to come out, is to e6. What Black usually does in the exchange variation is he delays the development of this bishop until he settles on the development of his other pieces. So Black will quite probably play bishop d6, and his scheme of development is knight e7, so as not to block the f-pawn, but more importantly, to aid in the development of this bishop to the f5 square. I'll get rid of this paint. So this bishop will come out so as not to be blocked by the knight when it goes to e7. Now, again, White is confronted with what to do, since Black has prevented the development of the c1 bishop to an effective square f4. White sets about making a decision about his other pieces, and so he will place his knight on f3, at which point Black can place his bishop on g4, initiating a pin. And as you all know from our measures of piece activity, that attacking a piece and restricting its movement are two good measures of piece activity. So we can say that the c8 bishop comes to a quite effective development on g4, should the knight come to f3. And there have been many ways of treating this problem of dealing with Black's queen's bishop. So while the exchange variation is simple to play, it quickly developed the pieces. White quickly develops the pieces in castles. The exchange gives Black a rather an easy time for the development of his c8 bishop, should bishop d3 and knight f3 be played. Now, White might address the problem of the development of this king's knight. Well, what white wants to do is he wants to castle quickly and seize the e-file. So he might attempt to develop the knight at e2 when bishop g4 is not so effective, and the knight on e2 aids the bishop in coming out to f4. The problem with placing a knight on e2, of course, is quite obvious. The queen's action is blocked along this line, and the knight is less strongly influenced. The knight is more defensive on e2 than it would be on f3. Sure, it performs a defensive function guarding d4, but it will hardly have an influence on black's game if it's on e2. Much less so than if it were on f3. So the exchange variation is quite popular at your level for the main reason that it's much more difficult for a chess player to do what he should do, which is maintain the tension. Juniors and developing players find it difficult to develop their game while maintaining the tension in the position, i.e., what I mean by keeping the tension is keeping your options open, so to speak. So going back to e4, e6, and after here, white sets up a classical center with d4, and after d5, he has two main possibilities from here. There's the classical variation, which is knight c3. There's a classical variation, which is knight c3. And this opening here, which is knight d2, which came into prominence in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and is popularized by German Grandmaster Siegbert Tarrasch. His idea behind that was he didn't like the problems that came with the pin that occurs after knight c3. So, first of all, the classical variation arose, and its main idea was Black created a fundamental problem for himself when he put the pawn on e6. The consequences of such a placement are that this deadens the effect of the c8 bishop because it's blocked. Okay? So while Black is supporting his pawn at d4 or d5 and securing a central foothold so it will be easy to develop his pieces, he does have the drawback of slowing down essentially the development of his queen side by keeping the c8 bishop in. So the French has a very deep and strategic idea behind it, whereby white says, you know what, you saddled yourself with a bad bishop, an inactive bishop, and so I'm going to play the rest of the game based on the inactivity of this bishop. So knight c3. Now, Black is confronted with a problem. How does he effectively develop his pieces? He can develop his kingside pieces, knight f6 and bishop e7, but each of those moves will bring with it their own problems. Knight f6 will be subject. Knight f6 will be subject. So after knight c3, knight f6 here will be subject to a territory gaining advance, e5. Now, this idea was explored by the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, and he said that, you know what, you close the center, but you slow the game down considerably. It's a closed position now, and play will now revolve around various kinds of pawn breaks with, after knight d7, the various pawn breaks f6 and c5, and for white, the implementation of the possible pawn break f4, f5. These plans should be pursued as early and as vigorously as possible, because the aim of these pawn breaks is to open the position for each side's pieces. So Steinitz said, after knight f6 or knight c3, I'll play knight f6. You'll gain a tempo. I'll put my knight on d7, and then I'll play for my pawn break with c5. And this is an important pawn break for black to get in, this one here, because of the fact that if white is left alone, he will reposition this knight at c3 and place the pawn at c3. And if he's able to do this, then this pawn triangle that arises here and here will have a very strong cramping effect on black's game. So once the center is closed, the battle revolves around the execution of an effective pawn break. And for black, that is going to be c5 well before f6. Okay? So the idea of the Steinitz variation is to close up the position and deal with the strategic problem of the c8 bishop a little bit later on. Now, what happens against the classical variation is you have the Steinitz variation, and you also have the presentation of Simon Winower, which said, you know what, the battle is revolving around the central white squares. So I'm going to play bishop b4. And this is why Tarrasch developed the way of placing, of dealing with the pressure on the e-pawn by placing the knight on d2, which we'll talk about in a second. So Simon Winower came along and said, you know what, I'm going to attack the central white squares. Remember our measures of activity, and that's what chess is all about: gaining territory and fast freedom of choice in order to choose how you will play your game. So bishop b4 says, you know what, I'm going to pin your knight and attack the e-pawn. Each move, every move, I have often stressed that we should talk about consequences thinking. And in consequences thinking, you look at the last move, what it was, what it is, and you ask, what good does it do for my opponent's position, and what bad, what negative factors does it do for my opponent's position? So the good things are obviously the pin on the knight and the attack on the e-pawn. But unfortunately, the negative aspect of the placement of this bishop here is that this pawn is left unguarded. And this will present a strategic problem for black in the coming moves. This is an unprotected unit, and as I've stressed in many classes, it is, you look around for unprotected units, and if you can attack them, then you should think about doing so. And so there are sharp lines that center around queen g4 and queen g7 with the obvious simple threats like that. And we get a very sharp game in which black can hold his own. Of course, it requires theoretical knowledge, but black can hold his own against queen g4. And the reason this is so is because white breaks the fundamental principle of developing the queen too early. And so black gains tempos against the queen. Okay. So Winower said, I'm going to pin, and white took care of this problem by gaining some space with e5. And so what black does is he says, okay, my knight can't come to f6, but it could go to e7. However, what I should do is, before I do that, I should get the counterplay going against the white center. And so before playing knight e7, he plays c5. And this presents white with a problem, because black wants to take on d4, and the removal of this base pawn causes problems in the future for the e5 pawn, because black now has a strategic plan of attacking this pawn after he takes out the base. Also, black also threatens, after pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, to gain a tempo for the development of his pieces by playing knight c6. White can deal with that, of course, by bringing out the bishop or making sure that a piece captures on the d4 square in preparation for that. However, it's thought that since this bishop is brought out and I can now open the position sometime in the future, it is desirable to capture this bishop if I can, or at least set it off on the side. And so white plays a3 and asks this bishop the question, are you staying, taking, or going? Staying, well, you obviously will die unless you create a counter threat equal to what I'm threatening. So of course, black could do that, and this could occur, and this could occur. And this leads to a sharp game for both sides, wherein white has the pair of bishops and possibilities of opening up the position, but black has possible attacks against the weakened e5 pawn. However, black prefers not to give white such an easy time of it, so to speak, and can play the Armenian variation by playing bishop a5, keeping his options open, or he can play the classical line with bishop takes on c3 with check. Usually when you're developing your pieces, you don't want to waste time in the development of their pieces. And so black, after a3, continues with this move, and after takes, he then plays knight. Well, there are several moves here. This move, possibly queen b6 or queen a5, and the development of the king's knight here. So the French defense is quite strategically rich on how black will approach the development and removal of the restraining pawns at d4 and e5. He usually does this by playing knight e7. He prefers to do this. The reason he does this is because he wants to initiate quickly an attack on the base pawn or the head pawn, while keeping his options open as to what he will do regarding this. And he gives white the opportunity, which white seizes more often than not, by playing the very sharp queen g4. And this blitz variation, it's called Blitzkrieg Variation, is a very sharp way of playing and leads to some very contentious ways of approaching the strategic pawn of lifting the blockade of the e6, d5 pawns. White wants to maintain this blockade because, of course, it gives him more space and attacking chances on the king side. And black, of course, wants to remove this problem and develop pressure on the center. In the blitz variation, there are several approaches. You could play for the removal of the central pawn, which leads to a rather long and complex line, which goes, black usually takes this, White proceeds with his threat. Black deals with that. White captures this pawn, and then black plays any number of moves here. Queen c7, queen b6, queen a5, knight c6, etc. And black pursues the aim of destroying the blockade. This is one of the fundamental French defense variations and shows very clearly the strategic idea of lifting the blockade in action and that of maintaining the blockade for white. What white gets in this line, he lets go of his center, so to speak, but thus he gains a very powerful h-pawn. However, while his center is collapsing, he will try and run his h-pawn down the board and create some serious problems for.
Wow, what were you doing?
If you could mute yourself, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. So this is a very sharp line, and knight at g to e7 lures white into playing queen g4. White, of course, doesn't have to play queen g4. And in this position, can play moves such as, okay, you can go back one move. He can play other ways of defending the center, and that usually will center around possibly playing knight f3.
安妮，你给我洗澡去，快点！你还有一堆作业没做，你给我洗澡去。洗完澡给我记得做作业。
So, knight f3 is usual, f4 is possible, a4 is possible. It gives a lot of rich strategic ideas. Okay, in some sense, the French defense is very similar to the London system in that the game develops slowly and contains several strategic ideas that can be implemented at various points in the game. Usually for black, in the position, say, after queen g4 or knight f3, is either to play for the destruction of the center with queen g4, or if knight f3, to continue developing his pieces and keeping his options open. Okay? Now, so essentially, it's usually not a good idea after, say, knight f3, to release the tension in the center with pawn takes pawn. This is very helpful for white. And what black is saying when he does this is that he only has one lever left over, and that is f6. This lever, of course, has the drawback of potentially weakening the king side, in the sense that after pawn takes pawn, the e6 pawn would be weak. And if pawn takes pawn, opening the f file, after pawn takes pawn or knight takes pawn, white's king or black's king will be potentially a little bit weaker. So black should keep the tension and not be so quick to play cd4. So let's go back. And after knight f3, he should perhaps continue with developing his pieces, possibly with queen a5, which puts pressure on the center because of the pin along the a5 e1 diagonal. He can also play knight c6 and put pressure on the d pawn directly, and play to implement both of these breaks. So a strategically rich game. So what's going on strategically in this position is that white has more space, more territory, as shown by the head pawn at e5, and he has the bishop pair, which is thought to be a theoretical and concrete advantage, depending on if the position can be opened up. So he has more space, the bishop pair, However, he has a strategic problem of a crippled pawn structure and how to develop his queen's bishop. Black's problems are a little bit more difficult to deal with. He still has the c8 bishop to bring out, and he has less space. But as compensation, he has a decent pawn structure. Interestingly enough, after knight f3, Black isn't worried in this position, incidentally. He's not worried about White dealing with the problem of pressure against the pawn by playing pawn takes pawn. He's not too concerned about this because of the fact that he gains immediate pressure against these two pawns by placing his queen aggressively. And he will essentially have an easy time of gaining back his pawns. For example, he could go knight here and hit these two pawns. He can bring his queen out to any number of squares where she initiates a fork, and in general has an easy time of development. So White shouldn't send his pawn away from the center unless he has a clear and specific plan. With pawn takes pawn, White says, you know what? I'm going to develop as quickly as possible and open up the position for the potential of my two bishops. So yeah, you're going to spend time recovering the pawn, but I am going to quickly develop my pieces and hopefully get an attack against your king that will be possibly stuck in the center. For this, White will need to play c4 or f4, f5, and he will follow plans that center around those ideas. All right, so we have a rich strategic game. Oh yeah, I have a couple of questions. Okay, excellent. Oh, this is the tournament link that's just been posted in the chat. So you will be able to practice some of the things that we've discussed here in the tournament that's going to be upcoming after the game or after the lecture. Okay, we'll put that aside for now. All right. So pawn takes pawn isn't usually what White wants to do in these positions. Remember, develop your pieces. It doesn't matter what opening it is. You just may have to deal with the problems of the pawn structure, telling your pieces where they can and cannot go. Okay. So in the classical variation, bishop c3 is by far the most popular, although bishop a5, the Armenian variation, aims to keep the bishop and cause some problems for White as regards his pawns. Remember, the knight on c3, the consequence of its placement there is that it stops the c pawn from linking up with the d pawn. And so I play bishop a5, and then I play pawn takes pawn, and I get all the good things without having given up my bishop. However, there are strategic problems that go along with bishop a5 as well. Bishop a5, and then possibly b4 with a gambit. This is very sharp. And White says, you know what? Guess what? The c pawn has been lured away from the center, and thus my d4 and e5 pawns maintain their cramping effect on your position. The only lever that you have to effectively initiate counterplay is going to be with your f pawn, which is going to be weaken your king. So what I'll do is I'll move my knight away, and I will aim to cause some serious problems on the dark squares. Here's what you've done. You've won a couple of pawns, right? You got 8, I got 6, but I'm threatening to recover one of them and I'm threatening to stick a knife right in your house, right? I'm going, remember, the 4 ranks on your side of the board, 8, 7, 6, and 5 are black's house, and 1, 2, 3, 4 are white's house. And so the knight is going to establish himself right in the living room of the black position. Hi, king, you're going to lose your castle. F7 is going to be weak. You're going to have trouble developing your bishop. Once the dark-bound bishops are gone, I'm going to recover the sacrificed pawn, and I'm going to have a ton of open lines to attack you with. So 3 and 2 is 5, 7. I'm going to have 6 pawns. So for the pawn, I'm going to have a super well-established knight and lots of open lines to attack you with and more space. Very double-edged position in the Armenian variation. Lots of strategic problems for both sides. And this is just one possibility. There are many others. So black usually takes after a3, but can retreat with bishop a5. So Tarrasch didn't want any of this. So what Tarrasch did is he said, you know what? I can take care of this problem of bishop coming to b4. If it does, it would just be a waste of time because I'll play c3. And this is not a good course of action for you because I've secured my center. I've secured my center. I've maintained the tension. And I have easy development for my pieces as regards the knight coming to f3 and the bishop coming to d3. So this would be a dream for white. He's developing quickly, controlling the center, and keeping his options open. Not something black wants. So black is not going to play bishop b4. He's going to center on other ways of development. And that occurs with knight f6, or bishop e7, or the Rubinstein variation with pawn takes pawn. The strategic ideas behind each of these moves is, with knight f6, I would like a white to close the center, or while maintaining tension. So I would like you to close the center, or if you do maintain the tension with bishop d3, I have the options of exchanging a pair of pieces and partially dealing with the problem of my queen's bishop. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and then b6. This might be one way of playing. What you're aiming to do, of course, is put the bishop on b7 or a6. But black doesn't often do this because of the fact that he's going to have to exchange several pieces after queen f3. Obviously, what the threat is to play knight f6 check and then take the rook. And of course, completing the fianchetto doesn't do anything for black because after knight takes f6 and whatever captures on f6, then the queen goes and lands on the b7 bishop. So while this is a possibility of play, one of the compromises that happens is black has to adopt this formation. And unfortunately, the bishop will then have to take a move or two to get onto the long diagonal or challenge this bishop on d3. Black is thought to have a playable position, but just playable. And look at the quick development that is occurring for the white pieces. You'll be able to put some pressure on the position. This comes not without some risk, however, because there is a problem with this e pawn. Now, I would like you guys to note here that there's a little trick. b6 after queen f3, queen takes pawn is not possible. First of all, because of the aforementioned knight takes f6, but secondly, because white can gain a lot of quick development with knight e2 if he didn't see knight f6. So the d pawn is indirectly protected because of the higher order threat, knight f6, and the threat to the rook. Now, again, should white or black play pawn takes pawn if white maintains the tension? No. He should maintain the tension. He shouldn't simplify. And so here, he should continue with a strategic plan, exploiting the fact that the d pawn is unprotected and play a quick c5. But some of you will say, well, don't you get an isolated pawn after that? You know what will happen after c5 here? Well, what could happen is pawn takes pawn, and after pawn takes pawn, because you don't really want to bring the queen out too early. Although bringing the queen out does have, certain possibilities. There's direct pressure on this and possibilities of playing this move sometime in the future if you're properly prepared. And the queen on d5 does support the advance of this pawn to e5. But the problem is the queen is brought out too early, and this is fundamentally good for white. But you might try it in the game, some game here, if you decide to play the Tarrasch. Anyway, pawn takes pawn is usually played. And after, say, pawn takes pawn, because, okay, black's threat is to go here and gain some space and force the bishop to leave a strong post along this diagonal. So white plays pawn takes pawn, and black follows up with pawn takes pawn. And we have a different strategic battle going on. Black says, I will have an isolony, an isolated pawn, a theoretical weakness. Is it strong or is it weak, such a pawn? But I'm going to get free and easy development. Knight comes to its fundamental best square. This bishop comes to a powerful, straightforward diagonal. This bishop on c8 can figure on a good future depending on how white develops. This knight is not going to be cramped by any white pawns coming into the center. I have good play. The general theme when you have an isolony is you want to attack your opponent. And so black will be aiming to keep the pieces on the board. And white will be aiming for an endgame wherein the queens and a couple of pairs of minor pieces come off the board. The strategic square in isolated pawn positions is the square in front of the pawn for both sides. The weaker side, or the theoretically weaker side, wants to be able to advance the pawn. And the stronger side, the side not possessing the isolony, or the theoretically stronger side, not possessing the isolony, wants to aim to control this square and thus blockade this pawn and keep the pieces bottled up, so to speak. But this leads to a strategically complex game. And Tarrasch was interested in this from both sides. So what's the response after c5? Well, not to take away from the center, but to play c3. And maintain the pawn at d4 and continue development of his pieces. So the Tarrasch is strategically complex. Bishop d3 is a way to deal with this problem. And pawn takes pawn, or maintenance of the tension, is the objective for both sides while developing the pieces. The big problem with the Tarrasch is the placement of the knight at d2, which interferes with the smooth development of the c1 bishop, and because it doesn't develop freely, the c1 rook has a problem coming out. Some things here. If pawn takes pawn, the knight takes pawn. And now not b6, but simply continuing to develop the pieces. And this can be addressed by knight d7, the consequences of which are blocking this bishop's action. But the good thing, consequences are, it supports the knight at f6. Sorry. It supports the knight at f6. And interestingly enough, gives space for this rook at b8. So I might be able to implement the plan. Oh, also, using consequences thinking, the knight on d7 provides a shield along this diagonal for the e8 king, which means I can consider b6 in the future. And if a bishop b5, I'll just put the knight or the bishop on b7, and I will have achieved my objectives. Of course, before playing a bishop to b5, white will have to take care of the knight's posting on e4. So knight d7 is one way of preparing the development of the queen's bishop. c5 is another way, a pretty radical one, because it says, you know what, I'll temporarily sack this pawn, which I can recover with check, and I'll be able to take this. So this might be viewed as a simplifying maneuver, but the problem is that white will be giving up the bishop pair in a position that will be quite open. And this is why it's probably better if black is going to play c5 to do so before he brings a knight to the center and solves white's problems of development of the queen side. All right, so what other ways to deal with the knight f6 problem in the Tarrasch? Well, the obvious one is to gain a tempo and gain some space. And Steinitz and other masters who explored the strategic idea in closed positions liked the development of the game from here. However, after this, the white is able to link up the pawns. Black initiates his pawn break, and white sets about the development of his pieces. And so we see a deep strategic battle shaping up. Black will not be able to easily remove these two central pawns from blockading these two pawns. White can put the knight here. He can put the knight on b3, depending on circumstances, or f3, and he can possibly play f4. The good thing for such a situation here is that white has a lot of space on the king side. The pawns point in that direction. However, the difficulty is that what am I doing about this bishop and this stuff here? Okay, black has one pawn break going, and he's going to quickly get the other one going. And by doing so, he's going to have a fixed target on d4 and e5. So the game could continue further along these lines here. Okay, we don't want this move here. We don't like this at all. So we'll go here and we'll delete this thing. Okay. So after knight d2, we have knight f6, and this is the principal line. We have bishop e7, which is the Kellner variation. What this aims to do is keep the tension in the center and develop the pieces aggressively with here. And keep the defender of the dark squares here. Should white proceed with queen g4, he can play a g6 and possible h5 and drive off the queen, although that will come out with its own problems here. Or he can play de4. And de4 is, I believe, Rubinstein's idea. And one of the nice things about this move is, while black surrenders the center, what he does is he can play this move, de4, against either knight c3 or knight d2. He can play Rubinstein's idea of de, knight e4. Now, this is thought to give white a little bit much. The reason it gives white a little bit much is because the d pawn is more actively placed than the e pawn, and the knight has been brought into the center and black hasn't got any pieces out. What Rubinstein wants to do, however, is challenge said knight, and then black's challenging the unprotected piece. White is faced with a problem. Okay, what to do? Should I stay? Should I go? And the reason that he would be exchanging here is that he gets quick and easy development, and he's starting to create some serious threats. Right away, he's threatening to gain a significant initiative with bishop g5, after which the queen will go to a white square, and then the other bishop will come out, and black will face, the fact that the small pieces are gaining tempos against the queen. So if knight takes knight, what black can do is he can play for a dynamic pawn structure with pawn takes f6. Oh my goodness, what are you doing, Roy? You're suggesting that I have a horrible pawn structure. And what do I get for it? I can't easily send my pawns forward. And I present a target over the h-pawn. Well, this does, yes, it looks horrible, but black does have his counterplay based on the pressure that comes quickly down the g-file, the fact that he can quickly seize the diagonal for his bishop, and he can develop quickly with the knight coming here and an attack on the center pawn and mobilize his center pawns. So black is thought to get a ton of counterplay in here. And it should be noted that this pawn structure, as long as this bishop is hanging around here, is not so easy to kill the black king. Now, white wants to get his pieces out, but because this f6 pawn is guarding these two squares, where is this knight to go? So it usually goes to f3, but on f3, it interferes with the movement of the f pawn, and more importantly, it interferes with the strategic idea of white castling and lifting up his rook, which means that should white want to exploit this situation that black has created on the king side, he will have to move his king over here. And this will present black with lots of possibilities of opening lines, potentially against the king situated on the queen side. Of course, white can castle on the king side, but how to set up? If he goes to f3, then the knight on f3 interferes with this rook coming into action. And if knight f3 and bishop d3, yes, we're going to put some pressure on the king side, but what to do with the king? Put him on the king side, then black isn't so terrified, and he'll put his bishop here, possibly, and castle his own king. Now, A fan of this pawn structure and somebody who understood this quite well was a chess player who was prominent in the previous century, Alexander Morozovich. And his games should be looked at as examples of dynamic play in general, and play in this specific pawn structure, or in this French pawn structure with an open G file specifically. The bishop usually ended up on B7, and the bishop went to G7, pawn went to F5, and Black's king was, rather safe, and he developed his two bishops developed good, strong pressure against the center. So Rubinstein's variation is possible to play. So pawn takes pawn, and pawn takes pawn, as I said previously, can be played against both knight c3 and knight d2. Now, supposing after this you do not want to put your knight on f6 and have your queen brought out, nor do you want the double pawns that occur after knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, you could play what's called the Fort Knox variation, which is bishop d7, a very solid approach here. The idea is to get the queen's bishop into operation on the diagonal without wasting a tempo on bishop d7, or b6 and bishop b7. The bishop can get this action going because there is no quick attack. Sorry. The Fort Knox variation is what I know this setup as. And there is no quick attack on this, because when you play knight f3, my bishop will be at c6. You'll have to deal with this knight, and then I will deal with the e5 problem by playing this knight to d7. So I get the best of both worlds. My bishop crawls onto the long diagonal, and I prevent the invasion of my position with knight f3 and knight e5. So Black has quite a few options here. Knight f6, bishop d7. I wouldn't suggest f5, nor would I suggest c5. Although c5 is playable, I wouldn't want to go for it, so to speak. For example, if I did play c5, after pawn takes pawn, then already the threat is to exchange the queens. So if I did play c5 and white took this is the better way to take, obviously, because now I don't mind losing my castling rights if I have a pawn plus. So I say, okay, once the queens come off, it'll be an endgame, or more properly called a queenless middle game, because there's still, 4 minor pieces and 2 rooks on the board, right? So this is more properly looked at as a queenless middle game. And in such a situation, I have a pawn plus, and I have a way of easily holding on to the pawn, and this will be problems for you going forward. So by process of elimination, c5 shouldn't be played unless you can rely on your opponent playing the weaker knight takes pawn. So how do we approach this problem of c5? And if our opponent plays pawn takes pawn, what are we to do? Well, not very much, really, because you're going to have to move the queen, and then a knight is going to land on the d6 square, and there's only going to be problems for you. And on queen a5, hoping to have the pawn come forward like this, which it does, happily. And then when you play bishop takes pawn, you find that this lands here, and you're forked. a horrible end to your attempt to free yourself. So what this means is by process of elimination, c5 is not playable and has to be prepared. If you don't want the double pawns that come with the potential knight f6, then you play knight d7. Okay. The tournament starts in 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Allison. Very good of you to do that. So I'll quickly, we'll, I guess, come back to the French defense next week. As you can see, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot for you to explore. And I haven't even scratched the surface of knight f6 versus knight c3 and various other responses. And then, of course, there's the variation that is also very popular at this level, is after d4 and d5, there is the Nimzowitsch advanced variation, whereby white says, you know what, I believe your space problems, lack of territory is going to be a big problem for you. But this one is perhaps the easiest one for black to deal with because he just proceeds with c5. And after c5, white plays c3, and we get the long variation, knight c6. And black plays knight f3, or white plays knight f3. Black puts some pressure on the center again. And white says, how to deal with this? Oh, you know what? I'm going to set a trap. And this is a trap that many, well, if you were 1700 on elite chess, you don't fall for this trap. But you should be aware of it because there are some people who haven't seen it before and do fall for this. This is discovered check attack on the queen. Black says, oh, I win a pawn. Haha, I've won a pawn. And white says, after this, I get to win a queen. An unfortunate end to black's escapade of dissolving the tension too quickly. Okay, off you go. Enjoy the tournament and practice some of the ideas that I've brought up here. Thank you.